All right, guys. Guys, gals, everyone. So, third chapter of Andromeda Space-age by Ivan or Ivan Yefremov. Yefremov, probably butchering Russian. Russian is a language I would love to learn. Haven't really gotten around to doing so, but my plan is to spend a bit of time reading it. Not reading it, learning it, excuse me. um, Definitely fascinating for sure. The science fiction novel, I've read the first two chapters, which broadcasted here. I'm trying to read the third. In actuality, if I'm going to be crazy, there's like 16 chapters, I believe, in this book. 15 chapters. So the page count is 379 pages. So if I'm crazy, I would try to read all 15 chapters. But I think what may happen is I may just finish reading this chapter and then call it quits for the night because it is about 2 o'clock in the morning right now. It may take me another hour unless I read a little fast and stop with the commentaries. I enjoy putting commentaries. So fashion statement. Okay, and with that, my ring light just officially fell off, but so ignore that commotion. I'm gonna, give me 1 second. Let me see. This might actually be, I don't know, better, worse, who knows. Anyways, I might as well just get it for a moment. This, put the ring light around here somewhere, is actually just something from the local artist, April Deconic, which I have posted on the link, instagram.com/April Deconic Art. So April, APRIL, DECONICK ART. And it is, it's like a, I don't know, it's just kind of like a flowing sort of thing. I actually wear this sometimes when I'm making art, since I feel like it's like an artist palette. Makes me feel a little more inspired. But really, I just wear it whenever I feel like it, which is kind of matches the color scheme of the front cover in a little way. This could be nebulous for all you know, nebulous galaxies. So it's up to interpretation. I like color a lot. So with all that said, my colorful commentaries, let me just finish it here and move on to chapter 3, which is called Captives of the Dark. So we go back to the spaceship now. Chapter 2 was that the broadcasted message. So chapter 3 is back to the good old spaceship that is just encountered a dark star, if you recall. So really, yeah, so here you go. This is a little picture here. Captives of the Dark. Okay. Chapter 3, Captives of the Dark. The fat black arrows on the orange-colored animeson fuel indicator stood at 0. The spaceship had not escaped the iron star. Its speed was still great, and it was being drawn toward that horrible star that human eyes could not see. The astronavigator helped Ergnor, who was trembling from weakness and from the effort he had made, to sit down at the computing machine. The planetary motors, disconnected from the robot helmsman, faded out. Ingrid, what's an iron star? Asked K. Bear softly. All that time he had been standing motionless behind her back. An invisible star, spectral class T, that has become extinguished and is either in the process of cooling off or of reheating. It emanates the long infrared waves of the heat end of the spectrum, whose rays are black to us and can only be seen through the electronic inverter. An owl can see the infrared rays and therefore could see the star. Why is it called iron? There's a lot of iron in the spectrum of those that has been studied, and it seems there's a lot of it in the star's composition. If the star is a big one, its mass and gravity are enormous, and I'm afraid we're going to meet one of the big ones. What comes next? I don't know. You know yourself that we've got no fuel. We're flying straight towards the star. We must break Tantra down to a speed 1,000th of the absolute at which speed sufficient angular deviation would be possible. If the planetary fuel gives out too, the spaceship would slowly approach the star until it falls on it. Ingrid jerked her head nervously, and Kay gently stroked her bare arm, all covered with goose flesh. The commander of the expedition went over to the control decks and concentrated on the instruments. Everybody kept silent, almost afraid to breathe. Even Nisa Crete, who, although she had only just woke up, realized instinctively the danger of their situation. The fuel might be sufficient to break the ship, but with loss of velocity, it would be more difficult to get out of the tremendous gravitational field of the Iron Star without the ship's motors. If Tantra had not approached so close, and if Lin had realized in time, but what consolation was there in those empty ifs? Indeed. 3 hours passed before Ergnor had made his decision. Tantra vibrated from the powerful thrust of the trigger motors. Her speed was reduced. An hour, a second, a third, and a fourth. An elusive movement of the commander's hand, horrible nausea for everybody in the ship, and the terrifying brown star disappeared from the forward screen and reappeared on the second. Invisible bonds of gravity continued to hold the ship and recorded in the measuring instruments. 2 red eyes burned over Ergnor's head. He pulled a lever towards himself, and the motor stopped working. "We're out," breathed Lin in relief. The commander slowly turned his glance toward him. "We're not. We have only the iron ration of fuel left, sufficient for orbital revolution and landing." "What can we do?" "Wait, I've diverted the ship a little, but we are passing too close. A battle is now going on between the star's force of gravity and the reduced speed of Tantra. It's flying like a lunar rocket at the moment, and if it can get away, we should fly towards the sun and we'll be able to call Earth. The time required for the journey, of course, will be much greater. In about 30 years, we send out our call for help, and another 8 years later, it will come." 38 years! Oh, sorry, that was supposed to be a whisper. 38 years, Barrett whispered in scarcely audible tones in Ingrid's ear. She pulled him sharply by the sleeve and turned away. Ergnor leaned back in his chair and dropped his hands on his knees. Nobody spoke, and the instrument continued softly humming. Another melody, out of tune and therefore ominous, was added to the tuned melody of the navigation instruments. The call of the Iron Star, the great strength of its iron mass, pulling for the weakened spaceship, was almost physically tangible. Nisa Greet's cheeks were burning. Her heart was beating wildly. This inactive waiting had become unbearable. The hours passed slowly. One after another, the awakened members of the expedition appeared in the control tower. The number of silent people increased until all 14 were assembled. The speed of the ship had been progressively reduced until it reached a point that was lower than the velocity of escape, so that Tantra could not get away from the Iron Star. Her crew forgot all about food and sleep and did not leave the control tower for many miserable hours, during which the ship's course changed more and more to a curve until she was in the fatal elliptical orbit. Tantra's fate was obvious to the entire crew. A sudden howl made them all start. Astronomer Poor Heist jumped up and waved his hands. His distorted face was unrecognizable. He bore no resemblance to a man of the Great Circle era. Apparently, you can revert back to a non-Great Circle era person when you're in extreme distress. Okay. Fear, self-pity, and a craving for revenge has swept all signs of intellectuality from the face of the scientist. "Him! It was him!" howled Poor Heist, pointing to Lin. "That clot, that fool, that brainless worm." The astronomer choked as he tried to recall the swear words of his ancestors that had long before gone out of use. Nisa, who was standing near him, moved away contemptuously. Ergnor stood up. "The condemnation of a colleague would not help us. The time has passed when such action could have been intentional." In this case, Nor spun the handles on the computing machine carelessly. As you see, there was a 30% probability of error. If we add to that the inevitable depression that comes at the end of a tour of a duty, and the disturbance due to the pitching of the ship, I don't doubt that you, Poor Heist, would have made the same mistake. "And you?" shouted the astronomer, but with less fury than before. "I should not. I saw a monster like this at close quarters during the 36 space expedition. It is mostly my fault. I hoped to pilot the ship through the unknown region myself, but I did not foresee everything. I confined myself to giving simple instructions." "How could you have known that they would enter this region without you?" exclaimed Nisa. I should have known it, answered Ergnor firmly, in this way refusing the friendly aid of the astronavigator. But there's no sense in talking about it until we get back to Earth. To Earth, whined poor Heist, and even Pelin frowned in perplexity. Just say that when all is lost and only death lies ahead of us. Not death, but a gigantic struggle lies ahead of us, answered Ergnor confidently, sitting down in a chair that stood before the table. Sit down. There's no need to hurry until Tantra has made 1.5 revolutions. Those present obeyed him in silence, and Nisa gave the biologist a smile, triumphant despite the hopelessness of the moment. This star undoubtedly has a planet, even two, I imagine, judging by the curve of the isograph. The planets, as you see, the commander made a rapid but accurate sketch, should be big ones, and therefore should have an atmosphere. We don't need a land, though. We have enough atomized solid oxygen. Ergnor stopped to gather his thoughts. We shall become the satellite of the planet and travel in orbit around it. If the atmosphere of the planet is suitable and we use up our air, we have sufficient planetary fuel to land and call for help. In 6 months, we can calculate the direction, transmit to Earth the results obtained from Zerda, send for a rescue ship, and save our ship. If we do save it, poor Heist pulled a wry face as he tried to hide the joy that kindled anew in his heart. Yes, if we do, agreed Ergnor. That, however, is clearly our goal. We must muster all our forces to achieve it. You, poor Heist, and Ingrid Dietra, make your observations and calculate the size of the planets. Bear and Nisa, compute the velocity from the mass of the planets, and when you know that, compute the orbital velocity of the spaceship and the optimal radiant for its revolutions. The explorers began to make preparations for landing should it prove to be necessary. The biologist, the geologist, and the physician prepared a reconnaissance robot. The mechanics adjusted the landing locators and searchlights and got ready a rocket satellite that would transmit a message to Earth. The work went particularly well after the horror and hopelessness they experienced, and was only interrupted by the pitching of the ship in gravitational vortices. Tantra, however, has so reduced her speed that the pitching no longer caused the people great discomfort. Poor Heist and Ingrid established the presence of 2 planets. They had to reject the idea of approaching the outer planet. It was huge in size, cold, encircled by a thick layer of atmosphere that was probably poisonous and threatened them with death. If they had to make a choice of death, it would probably have been better to burn up on the surface of the iron star than drown in the gloom of an ammonia atmosphere by plunging the ship into a 1,000-kilometer thick layer of ammonia ice. There were similar terrible gigantic planets in the solar system: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Tantra continued to approach the star. In 19 days, it determined the size of the inner planet, and it proved to be bigger than Earth. The planet was quite close to the sun, the iron star, and was carried around its orbit at frantic speed, its year being no more than 2 or 3 terrestrial months. The invisible star T no doubt made it quite warm with its black rays, and if there was an atmosphere, life could have emerged there. In the latter case, landing would be particularly dangerous. Aliens for forms of light that had developed under conditions of other planets and by other evolutionary paths, and had the albumin cells common to the whole cosmos, were extremely dangerous to Earth dwellers. The adaptation of the organism to protect itself against harmful refuse and disease bacteria that have been going on for millions of centuries on our planet was powerless against alien forms of life. To the same degree, life from other planets was in similar danger on Earth. The basic activity of animal life, in killing to devour and devouring to kill, made its appearance with depressingly brutal cruelty when the animal life of different worlds clashed. Fantastic diseases, instantaneous epidemics, the terrible spreading of pests, and horrible injuries beset the first explorations of habitable but uninhabited planets. Worlds that were inhabited by intelligent beings made numerous experiments and preparations before establishing direct spaceship communications. On our Earth, far removed from the central parts of the galaxy where life abounds, there have been no visitors from the planets of other stars, no representatives of other civilizations. The Astronomical Council has shortly before completed preparations for the reception of visitors from the planets of not too distant stars in the Ophiuchus, Cygnus, Ursa Major, and Apus constellations. Ergnor, worried by the possibility of meeting with unknown forms of life, ordered the biological means of defense that he had taken a big supply of in the hope of visiting Vega to be brought out of the distant storerooms. Alas, Tantra equalized her orbital velocity with that of the planet, and it began to revolve around it. The indefinite dark brown surface of the planet, or rather of its atmosphere, with the reflections of the bloody brown sun, can only be seen through the electronic inverter. All members of the expedition were busy at the instruments. The temperature of the upper layers of the daylight side is 320 degrees on the Kelvin scale. Rotations about the axis approximately 20 days. The locators show the presence of water and land. The thickness of the atmosphere is 1,700 kilometers. The exact mass is 43.2 times Earth mass. The reports followed one another continuously, and the nature of the planet was becoming clear. Ergnor summarized the figures as he came in and was making preparations to compute the orbit. The planet was a big one, 43.2 times the mass of Earth, and its force of gravity will hold the ship pressed down to the ground. The people will be as helpless as flies on a flypaper. The commander recalled the terrible stories he had heard, half legend, half history, of the old spaceships that had, for various reasons, come into contact with the huge planets. In those days, the slow ships with low-powered fuel often perished. Then came with the roar of motors and the spasmodic shuddering of a ship that could not get away but remained stuck to the surface of the planet. The ship remained intact, but the bones of the people trying to crawl about the ship were broken. Well, that sounds horrible. The indescribable horror of great weight had been communicated in the fragmentary cries of last reports and the farewell transmissions. The crew of Tantra were not menaced by that danger as long as they revolved about the planet. If they had to land on the surface, however, only the strongest people would be able to drag the weight of their own bodies in this, the future haven that was to be theirs for many long years. Could they keep alive under such conditions, crushed by the great weight in the eternal darkness of the infrared rays of the black sun in a dense atmosphere? Whatever the conditions were, it was a hope of salvation. It did not mean death. Anyway, there was no choice. Tantra's orbit drew closer to the outer fringe of the atmosphere. The expedition could not miss the opportunity of investigating a hitherto unknown planet that was comparatively close to Earth. The lighted, or rather heated side of the planet differed from the night side, not only by its much greater temperature, but by the huge agglomerations of electricity that so interfered with the powerful locators that their indications were distorted beyond recognition. Ergnor decided to study the planet with the help of bomb stations. They sent out a physical research robot, and the automatic recorder reported on an astonishing quantity of free oxygen in an atmosphere of neon nitrogen, the presence of water vapor, and a temperature of 12 degrees Celsius. These were conditions that in general were similar to those on Earth, but the presence of the thick atmosphere was 1.4 times that of the normal pressure of Earth, and the force of gravity was 2.5 times greater. "We can live here," sighed the biologist, smiling feebly as he reported the station's findings to the commander. "If we can live on that gloomy, heavy planet, then something is probably living there already, something small and harmful." For the spaceship's 15th revolution, a bomb beacon with a powerful transmitter was prepared. The second physical research station, dropped on the night side when the planet had rotated through 120 degrees, disappeared without sending out any signals. "It has fallen into the ocean," said geologist Bina Led, biting her lips in annoyance. "We must feel our way with the main locator before we put out a TV robot. We've only got 2 of them." Tantra emitted a bunch of directed radio waves as she revolved around the planet, feeling for the contours of seas and continents that, owing to distortion, were unclear. They found the outlines of a huge plain that thrust out into the ocean, or divided 2 oceans, almost on the planet's equator. The spaceship's rays zigzagged across a strip of land 200 kilometers wide. Suddenly, a bright point flared up on the locator screen. A whistle that lashed their strained nerves told them that it was no hallucination. "Metal!" exclaimed the geologist. "An open deposit." Ergnor shook his head. "Although the flash did not last long, I managed to notice regular outline. That was a huge piece of metal, a meteorite, or a ship," exclaimed Nisa and the biologist together. "Fantasy," snapped Poor Heis. "It may be fact," objected Ergnor. "What does it matter? It's no use arguing," said Poor Heis, unwilling to give in. "There's no way of proving it. We're not going to land, are we?" "We'll check up on it in 3 hours of time when we reach that plane again. Notice that the metal object is on the plane that I too would have chosen to land on. We'll throw out the TV robot at that very spot. Tune the locator array to a 6-second warning." The commander's plan was successful, and Tantra made another 3-hour flight around the dark planet. The next time the ship approached the continental plane, it was met by TV broadcasts from the robot. The people peered into the light screen. With a click, the visible ray was switched on and peered like a human eye, noting the outlines of things far down below in that 1,000-kilometer deep black abyss. K-Bear could well imagine the head of the robot station sticking out of the armor plate and revolving like a lighthouse. The zone that was swept by the instrument's eye appeared on the screen and was there and then photographed. The view consisted of low cliffs, hills, and the winding black lines of watercourses. Suddenly, the vision of a gleaming fish-shaped object crossed the screen and again melted into the darkness as it was abandoned by the light ray to the darkness and the ledges of the plateau. "A spaceship!" gasped several voices in unison. Nisa looked at Poor Heist with undisguised triumph. The screen went dark as Tantra left the area of the TV robot's activity, and Yeon Thao immediately set about developing the film and electronic photographs. With fingers that trembled with impatience, he placed the film in the projector of the hemispherical screen that would give them stereoscopic pictures of what had been photographed. The inner walls of the hollow hemisphere gave them a large picture. The familiar cigar shaped outlines of the ship's bows, the bulge of the stern, the high ridge of the equilibrium receiver, no matter how unbelievable it all was, no matter how utterly impossible they might regard a meeting here on the dark planet, the robot could not invent anything. A terrestrial spaceship lay there. It lay horizontally in the normal landing position, supported by its powerful landing struts, undamaged as though it had only just alighted onto the planet of the Iron Star. Contra, revolving a shorter orbit closer to the planet, sent out signals that were not answered. A few more hours passed. The 14 members of the expedition again gathered in the control tower. Ignora, who had been sitting in deep contemplation, stood up. I propose to land Tantra. Perhaps our brothers are in need of help. Perhaps our ship is damaged and cannot return to Earth. If so, we can take them, transfer the animation, and save ourselves. There is no sense in sending out a rescue rocket. It cannot do anything to give us fuel, and will use up so much energy that there will not be enough left to send a signal to Earth. Suppose the ship is here because of a shortage of animation, asked Paling cautiously. Then it should have ion planetary charges. They could not have used up everything. As you see, the spaceship is in its proper position, which means it landed with the planetary motors. We'll transfer the ion fuel, take off again, and go into orbit. Then we can call Earth for help, and in case of success, that won't take more than 8 years. And if we can't get animation, then we should have one out. Maybe they have photon, not ion chargers for the planetary motors, said one of the engineers. We can make use of them in the big motors if we fit them with auxiliary ball reflectors. I see you have thought of everything, says the engineer, giving in. There's still the risk of landing on a heavy planet and the risk of living there, muttered Porheis. It's awful just to think of that world of darkness. The risk, of course, remains, but there is risk in our very situation. We should hardly increase it by landing. The planet on which our spaceship will land is not a bad one as long as we do not damage the ship. Ergnor cast a glance at the dial of the speed regulator and walked swiftly to the control desk. For a whole minute, he stood in front of the levers and vernier scales of the controls. The fingers of his big hands moved as though they were selecting chords on some musical instrument. His back was bent and his face turned to stone. Nisa went up to him, boldly took his right hand and pressed the palm to her smooth cheek. Hot from excitement, Ergnor nodded in gratitude, stroked the girl's mass of hair, and straightened himself up. We are entering the lower layers of the atmosphere to land, he said loudly, switching on the warning siren. The howl carried throughout the ship, and the crew hurried to strap themselves into hydraulic floating seats. Ergnor dropped into the soft embrace of the landing chair that rose from the floor before the control desk. Then came the heavy strokes of the planetary engines, and the spaceship rushed down, howling, towards the cliffs and oceans of the unknown planet. The locators and the infrared reflectors felt their way through the primordial darkness below. Red lights glowed on the altimeter scales of 15,000 meters. It was not anticipated that there would be mountains much over 10,000 meters high on the planet, where water and the heat of the black sun had been working to level out the surface. The first revolution around the planet revealed no mountains, only insignificant heights, little bigger than those of Mars. Look as though the activity of the internal forces that gave rise to mountains has ceased or have been checked. Ergnor placed the altitude governor at 2,000 meters and switched on the powerful searchlights. A huge ocean stretched below the spaceship, an ocean of horror, an unbroken mass of black waves that rose and fell over unfathomable depth. The biologist wiped away the perspiration caused by his strenuous efforts. He was trying to catch in his instrument the faint variations in reflection from the black water to determine its salt and mineral contents. The gleaming black of the water gave way to the dull black of land. The cross rays of the searchlights cut a narrow lane between walls of darkness. Unexpectedly, there were patches of color in this lane, yellow sands and the grayish-green surface of a flat, rocky ridge. Tantra swept across the continent, obedient to the skilled hands of the commander. Alas, Ergnor found the plane he was looking for. It proved to be low-lying country that could not possibly be termed a plateau. I thought it was obvious that the tides and storms of the Black Sea would not reach it, lying as it did some 100 meters above the surrounding country. The locator on the spaceship's port bow whistled, Tantra searchlights followed the locator beam, and the clear outlines of a first-class spaceship came into view. The bow armor, made of an isotope of iridium, having a reorganized crystalline structure, shone like new in the rays of the searchlight. There was no temporary structure anywhere near the ship. There was no lights on board. It stood dark and lifeless and did not in any way react to the approach of the sister ship. The searchlight rays moved past the ship and were reflected from a huge disc with spiral projections as they would have been from a blue mirror. The disc was standing on edge, leaning slightly to one side, and was partly buried in the black soil. For a moment, the observers got the impression that there were cliffs behind this disk and that beyond them, the darkness was blacker and thicker, perhaps with a precipice or a slope leading down to the lowlands. The deafening roar of Tantra sirens shook the hull of the ship. Ergnor intended to land close to the newly discovered ship and was giving warning to any people who might be within the danger zone, that is, within a radius of some 1,000 meters from the landing place. The terrific roar of the planetary motors could be heard even inside the ship, and a cloud of red-hot dust appeared on the screens. The ship's floor began to rise up and then slip backwards. The hydraulic hinges of the landing seats turned them smoothly and soundlessly, keeping them perpendicular to the now vertical floors. The huge jointed landing strut slid out of the ship's hull, straightened out, and took the first shock of the landing on an alien world. A shock, a recoil, and another shock, and Tantra, her bows still swaying, came to a standstill at the same time as the engine cut out. Ergnor raised his hand to a lever on the control desk that was now directly over his head and released the jointed struts. Shortly, with a number of short jerks, the spaceship's bow sank toward the ground until the hull had assumed its normal horizontal position. The landing had been accomplished. As usual, the landing had shaken the human organism so strongly that the astronauts required some time to recover and remain semi-recumbent in their landing seats. I would have thought that a spaceship in the future would have a much smoother landing, but what do I know, right? There's no artificial gravity in this. Okay, that was like my first major side commentary. They were all held down by awful weight and were scarcely able to rise to their feet, like patients recovering slowly from a serious illness. The irrepressible biologist, however, had managed to take a sample of the air. "It's fit to breathe," he said. "I'll take a look at it through the microscope." "Don't bother," said Ergnor, unfastening the cushions of his landing chair. "We can't go out without a spacesuit. There may be very dangerous spores and viruses on this planet." In the airlock at the exit to the ship, biologically shielded spacesuits and quote-unquote jumping skeletons had been prepared in readiness for exploring party. The skeletons were steel leather-covered frames that were worn over the spacesuits and were fitted with electrical motors, springs, and shock absorbers to enable the explorers to move about under conditions of excessive weight. After 6 years traveling through interstellar space, every one of them wanted to feel soil, even alien soil, under his feet. Kay Bear, Poor Heist, Ingrid, Dr. Louis Lasvey, and 2 engineers had to remain on board the vessel to man the radio, searchlights, and various measuring and recording instruments. Nisa stood aside from the party with her space helmet in her hands. "Why do you hesitate, Nisa?" the commander called to her as he tested the radio set in the top of his helmet. "Come along to the spaceship." I, the girl stammered. "I believe it's dead. It's been standing here a long time." Another catastrophe, another victim claimed by the merciless Cosmos. Cosmos, by the way, is capitalized with a C. "I know it's inevitable, but still hard to bear, especially after Zerda and Algarb. Perhaps the death of the spaceship would mean life for us," said Poor Heist, who was busy training a short-focus telescope on the other ship, which still remained unlighted. 8 members of the expedition climbed into the airlock and waited. "Turn on the air," ordered Ergnor, addressing those who were remaining on the ship, and from whom they were now divided by an airtight wall. When the pressure in the airlock had risen to 10 atmospheres and was higher than that outside, hydraulic jacks opened the hermetically sealed doors. The air pressure in the lock was so great that it almost hurled the people out of the chamber, and at the same time preventing anything harmful in the alien atmosphere from entering the chamber. The door clanged to behind them. Okay, that's bad grammar. The door clanged behind them. The rays of a searchlight lit up a clear road along which the explorers hobbled on their spring legs, scarcely able to drag their own heavy weight along. The gigantic spaceship stood at the other end of the beam of light, about a mile away, a distance that seemed interminable to them in their impatience. They were badly shaken up by their clumsy jumps over uneven ground, covered with small boulders and greatly heated by the black sun. The stars made pale, diffuse patches when seen through the dense, highly humid atmospheres. Instead of the brilliant magnificence of the cosmos, the planet's sky showed only a faint suggestion of the constellations, the pale reddish lanterns of their stars unable to penetrate the darkness on the planet. The spaceship stood out in clear relief in the profound darkness of its surroundings. The thick, borated zirconium lacquer on the hull plates had been rubbed off in places. The ship must have been wandering about the cosmos for a long time. Exclamation repeating in all the radio telephones came from Eon Thaw. With his hand, he pointed to the ship's smaller lift that had been lowered to the ground and stood with its door wide open, or where undoubtedly plants grew around the lift and entered the ship's hull. Thick stems raised black bowls of parabolic shape nearly 3 feet above the ground. They had serrated edges, something like the teeth of a cogwheel, and it was difficult to say whether they were leaves or flowers. A mass of these motionless cogwheels growing together had an evil look about them. Still more disturbing was the silent open door of the lift. Untouched plants in an open door could only mean that nobody had used that way for a long time, that the people were not guarding their tiny terrestrial world from that which was alien to them. Ergnor, Ianthal, and Nisa Creed entered the lift, and the commander pressed a button. With a slight squeak, the machinery was set in motion, and the lift carried the explorers to the wide open airlock. They were followed by the others. Ergnor transmitted an order to switch off the searchlight on Tantra. An instant later, the tiny group of Earth dwellers was lost in utter darkness. The world of the Iron Sun enveloped them, as though trying to absorb that feeble spark of terrestrial life pressed down to the soil of the huge black planet. They switched on the revolving electric lanterns in their helmets. The inner doors of the airlock leading into the ship was closed, but not locked, and opened at a push. The explorers entered the central corridor and easily found their way through the dark alleyways. The spaceship differed but little from Tantra in its design. This ship was built less than 100 years ago, said Ergnor, drawing closer to Nisa. The girl looked round. Through the silicoid helmet, the commander's half-lighted face looked mysterious. Impossible idea, he continued. But suppose this is Paris. That's spelled P-A-R-U-S, exclaimed Nisa. She had forgotten the microphone and saw everybody turn towards her. The explorer made their way to the chief room of the spaceship, the combined library and laboratory, and from there continued towards the ship's control tower in the bows, staggering along his skeleton, swaying from side to side and hanging against the walls as he went. The commander switched the main switchboard. The ship's lights were switched on, but there was no current to keep them going. The phosphorescent signs and indicators still glowed in the darkness. Ergnor found the emergency switch, pressed it, and to their surprise, the lamps glowed dimly, but to the explorers, they seemed bright, blindingly bright. The light in the lift must have gone on too, for they heard the voice of poor Heist in their telephones asking about the results of the examination. Geologist being led answered him as the commander had suddenly stopped in the doorway of the control tower. Following his glance, Nisa looked up and saw between the four screens a double inscription in the letters of Earth and the symbols of the Great Circle. Paris. P-A-R-U-S. A line drawn under the word separated from the Earth's galactic call sign and the coordinates of the solar system. The spaceship that had disappeared 80 years before had been found in the system of the Black Sun, a system that had formerly been unknown and had been regarded as a dark cloud. An examination of the interior of the spaceship did not tell them what had happened to the ship's crew. The oxygen reservoirs were not empty. There were supplies of food and water sufficient for several years, but nowhere was there any trace or any remains of Paris' crew. Here and there in the corridors, in the control tower, in the library, there were strange dark stains on the walls. On the library floor, there was another stain that looked as though something that had been spilled there had dried in a warped film of several layers. Before the open door in the after bulkhead of the stern engine rooms, wires had been torn apart or were hanging down. The massive uprights of the cooling system made of phosphor bronze had been badly bent. Everything else in the ship was in perfect condition, so that this damage caused by a blow of tremendous force could not be explained. The explorers were becoming exhausted by their efforts, but were unable to find anything that would explain the disappearance and undoubted loss of Paris' crew. This was written before the Alien series. For me, it would seem like this is the start of some Alien novel, but obviously that is not what's going to happen. At least I don't think so. They did, however, make another discovery, one of the greatest importance. The supplies of antimicron fuel and ion charges for the planetary motors were sufficient for the takeoff Tantra and for the journey back to Earth. This information was immediately transmitted to Tantra and relieved all members of the expedition of that feeling of doom that had possessed them since their spaceship had been captured by the Iron Star. Nor would they have to carry out the lengthy work necessary to transmit message to Earth. There will be, however, the tremendous task of transfer the antimicron containers to Tantra. This would not have been an easy task anywhere, but there, on a planet where everything weighed 3 times as much as on Earth, it would require all the skill and ingenuity of the engineers. People of the Great Circle era, however, were not afraid of difficult mental problems. On the contrary, they enjoyed them. Sounds like me. Okay. From the tape recorder in the central control tower, the biologist removed the unfinished spool of the ship's logbook. Ergnor and the biologist opened the door of the hermetically sealed main safe where results of the Paris expedition were kept. The members of the expedition were burdened down with a heavy weight of numerous spools of photomagnetic films, logbooks, astronomical observations, and computations. They were explorers themselves and could not dream of leaving such a valuable find even for a moment. Mhm. Dead tired, the explorers were met in Tantra's library by their excited and impatient comrades. In surroundings to which they were accustomed, seated around a comfortable table under bright lights, the tomb-like gloom of the black world outside and the dead, abandoned spaceship seems like a gruesome nightmare. Nevertheless, the force of gravity of that awful planet continued to crush every one of them, and from time to time, one or another of the explorers would grimace with pain on making some movement. It had been very difficult, without considerable practice, to coordinate the movements of the body with those of the steel skeleton, so that ordinary walk became a series of jerks and severe shakings. The short journey to Paris and back has completely exhausted them. Geologist Bina Led was apparently suffering from a slight concussion of the brain, but she refused to go away before she had heard the last spool of the ship's logbook and remained leaning on the table with her hands pressed to her temples. Nisa expected something extraordinary from the workers that had lain for 80 years in a dead ship on that horrid planet. She imagined hoarse appeals for help, howls of suffering, tragic words of farewell. The girl shuddered when a cold, melodious voice came from the reproductor. Even Ignora, a man who possessed great knowledge of everything connected with interstellar flights, knew nothing of the crew of Paris. The crew had made up exclusively of young people who had set out on their fantastically courageous journey to Vega without giving the Astronautical Council the usual film about the members of the crew. The unknown voice reported events that occurred several months after the last message has been sent to Earth. 25 years before that, in crossing a cosmic ice zone on the fringe of the Vega system, Paris had been damaged. The crew managed to patch a hole in the ship's stern and continue their journey, but nevertheless upset the delicate regulations of the protective field of the motors. After a struggle that lasted 20 years, they had to stop the engines. Paris continued going 5 years by inertia until she was pulled aside by a natural inaccuracy in the ship's course. That was when the first message had been sent. The spaceship was about to send another message when she was caught in the field of the Iron Star. Then the same thing happened to Paris as it happened to Tantra, with the difference that Paris was without motors and had been unable to resist. Nor could Paris become a satellite of the Black Planet, since the planetary motors, housed in the vessel's stern, had been wrecked at the same time as the Anna-Meson motors. Paris landed safely on a low plateau near the sea. The crew set about carrying out 3 tasks of importance: the repair of the motors, the transmission of a message to Earth, and the study of the unknown planet. Before they had time to erect a rocket tower, people began to disappear mysteriously. Those sent out to look for them did not return. The exploration of the planet ceased. The remainder of the crew went out to the rocket tower only in a group, and for the long periods between spells of work that the strong force of gravity made extremely exhausting, they remained in their tightly sealed spaceship. In their hurry to send off the rocket, they had not even studied the strange spaceship in the vicinity of the Paris that had apparently been there a long time. Wait a minute. Okay, so there's apparently another spaceship, not just the Paris. That disc flashed through Nisa's mind. She met the commander's glance, and he, understanding her thoughts, nodded in affirmation. 6 out of 14 of the Paris crew had disappeared, but after the necessary measures had been taken, the disappearance stopped. There then followed a break of about 3 days in the logbook, and the story was taken up by a young woman's high-pitched voice. Today is the 12th day of the 7th month, year 723 of the Great Circle, and we who have remained alive had completed the construction of the rocket transmitter. Tomorrow, this time, K-Bear glanced instinctively at the time gradations along the tape. 5 a.m., Paris time. And who could know what time that would be on this planet? We are sending it reliably computed. The voice broke off and then began again, this time weaker and suppressed. As so as the speaker, I turned away from the microphone. I'm switching on. More. The tape recorder was silent, although the tape continued to unwind. Something must have happened, began Ingrid Dytra. Hurried, choking words from the tape recorder. 2 got away. Light is gone. She didn't jump far enough. The lift, they couldn't shut the outside door. Only the inside went. Mechanic Sach Cthulhu has crawled to the engines. We'll start the planetary motors going. There's nothing to them but fury and horror. They are nothing. Yes, nothing. For some time, the tape unwound in silence. Then the same voice began again. I don't think Cthulhu managed it. I'm alone, but I've thought of what to do before I begin. The voice grew stronger and then sounded with amazing strength. Brothers, if you find Paris, take heed of my warning. Never leave the ship at all. The woman who was speaking heaved a deep sigh and said as though talking to herself, I must find out about Cthulhu. I'll come back and explain in detail. Then came a clip, and the tape continued to unwind for about 20 minutes before it reached the end. The eager listeners waited in vain. The unknown woman had been unable to give any further details, just as she had probably been unable to return. Ergnor switched off the apparatus and turned to his companions. Our brothers and sisters who died in Paris will save us. Can't you feel the strong arm of the man of Earth? There's a supply of Anna-Meson on the ship. We have been giving a warning of the mortal danger that threatens us. I have no idea what it is, but it's undoubtedly some alien forms of life. If it had been elemental cosmic forces that have damaged the ship and not merely killed the people, it would be a disgrace if we could not save ourselves now that we have been given so much help. We must take our discoveries and those of Paris back to Earth. The great work of those who perished at their posts, their half-century struggle against the cosmos, must not have been in vain. How do you propose to get the fuel on board without leaving the ship? Asked K. Bear. Why without leaving the ship? You know that's impossible and that we have to go out and work outside. We've been warned and we're taking the necessary steps. I suppose you mean a barrage around the place where we're going to work, said biologist Ian Thao. Not only that, a barrage along the whole way between the two ships, added Poor Heist. Naturally, we don't know what to expect, so we'll make the barrage a double one, a radiation and electric wall. We'll put out cables and give a path of light all the way. There's an unused rocket standing behind Paris that contains sufficient energy for all the time would have to work. Bina Led's head dropped on the table with a thud. The doctor and the second astronomer moved their heavy bodies with difficulty towards her. It's nothing, explained Loma Lavsey. Concussion overstrain. Help me get Bina to bed. Even that simple task would not have been performed very quickly if Mechanic Terran had not thought of adapting an automatic robot car. With the help of the car, all the 8 explorers were taken to their beds. If they did not rest in time, organisms that had not yet adapted themselves to new conditions would break down. At this difficult moment, every member of the expedition was essential and irreplaceable. Soon, 2 universal automatic cars for transport purposes and road building were linked together and used to level the road between the 2 spaceships. Heavy cables were hung on both sides. Watchtowers of the protected hood of thick silico boron were erected at each of the spaceships. Each tower, observer from time to time, would send a fan-shaped bunch of death-dealing rays along the road from an impulse chamber. During the hours of work, the powerful searchlights were kept going all the time. The main hatch in Paris heel was opened, some of the bulkheads were removed, and 4 containers of animeson and 30 cylinders with ion chargers were made ready to load onto the cars. It would be more difficult to load them onto Tantra. They could not open the spaceship the way Paris was opened, and so allow whatever was engendered by the alien life of the planet, and which was probably lethal, to enter the ship. For this reason, they only made the necessary preparations inside the ship, but did not open the hatch. Interior bulkheads were removed, and containers of compressed air were brought from Paris. The plan was to blow a strong blast of air under high pressure down the shaft from the time the manhole was opened until the containers were loaded into Tantra. At the same time, the whole of the vessel will be screened by a radiation cascade. The expedition gradually grew accustomed to working in their steel skeletons and began to bear the triple weight somewhat more easily. The unbearable pain that all their bones that had begun as soon as they landed was also beginning to ease up. Several terrestrial days passed, and the mysterious nothing did not appear. The temperature of the surrounding atmosphere began to fall rapidly. A hurricane arose that increased in fury hour by hour. This was the setting of the black sun. The planet rotated, and the continent on which the spaceship stood plunged into night. The convection currents, the heat given off by the ocean, and the thick atmosphere prevented a sudden drop in temperature. But towards the middle of the planetary night, a sharp frost set in. The work continued with the heating system in the spacesuit switched on. They had managed to get the first containers out of Paris and transported to Tantra when at sunrise there came a hurricane much fiercer than had been the one at sunset. The temperature rose rapidly above freezing point. A current of dense air brought with it excessive humidity, and the sky was rent by endless flashes of lightning. The hurricane became so fierce that the spaceship began to tremble under pressure of the terrific wind. The crew concentrated all their efforts on safely anchoring the container under Tantra's keel. The fearful roar of the wind increased, and the dangerous whirling vortices on the plateau closely resembled a terrestrial tornado. In the searchlight beam, there appeared a huge whirlwind, a rotating column of water, snow, and dust, whose funnel reached the low, dark sky. The whirlwind broke the high voltage cables, and there were blue flashes caused by short circuits as the ends coiled up. The yellow light of Paris' searchlight disappeared as though the wind had blown it out. Ergnor gave the order to stop work and take cover in the ship. But there's an observer there, exclaimed geologist Bina Led, pointing to the faintly visible light of the silicon turret. I know, Nisa's there, and I'm going over there myself, answered the commander. The current is cut off, and nothing has come into its own, said Bina in serious tones. If the hurricane affects us, it will no doubt also affect nothing. I'm sure there's no danger until the storm dies down. I'm so heavy in this world that I won't be blown away if I crawl on the ground. I've been wanting to watch that nothing from an observation turret for a long time. May I come with you? Asked the biologist, jumping towards the commander. Come along. Only remember, I won't take anybody else. You need that. The two men crawled for a long time, hanging on to irregularities and cracks in the stones, and keeping as far as possible out of the way of the whirlwinds. The hurricane did its best to tear them from the ground, turn them over, and roll them along. Once it succeeded, Bergnor managed to catch hold of Ion Thal as he rolled past, dropping flat to his stomach, and caught hold of a big boulder with his hooked gloves. Nisa opened the hatch of her turret, and the two men crawled into the narrow space. It was quiet and warm inside. The turret stood firm, secured and anchored against the storms of wisdom had foreseen. The auburn... For some reason, Megan highlighted this part. The storms of wisdom have foreseen. Okay. I guess those are pretty words. The auburn-headed astronavigator frowned, but was glad to have companions. She frankly admitted that she was not looking forward to spending 24 hours alone in a storm on a strange planet. Who would, indeed? Ergnor informed Tantra of their safe arrival, and the searchlight was turned off. The tiny lamp in the turret was now the only light in that kingdom of darkness. The ground trembled under the gusts of wind, the lightning, and the passing whirlwinds. Nisa sat in a revolving chair with her back against the rheostat. The commander and the biologist sat at her feet on the round ledge formed by the base of the turret. In their spacesuits, they occupied almost all the space inside the turret. I suggest we sleep, came Ergnor's soft voice in the telephones. It's a good 12 hours to the black sunrise, when the storm would die down and it would be warmer. His companions readily agreed, and so the three of them slept, held down by triple weight, enclosed in their spacesuits, hampered by the stiff skeleton and the narrow confines of the turret that was shaken by the storm. Great is adaptability. Great is adaptability. Let's try this again. Great is Can I really not say this word? Adaptability. Oof. Great is the adaptability of the human organism, and great its powers of resistance! Exclamation point. From time to time, Nisa woke up, transmitted a reassuring message to the watchers on Tantra, and dozed off again. The hurricane was blowing itself out, and the tremors had ceased. The nothing, or more correctly, the something, might appear now. The observers on the turrets took VP vigilance pills, to liven up a tired nervous system. That other spaceship bothers me, confessed Nisa. I would so much like to know who they are, where they came from, and how they got here. Nisa's definitely a dreamer, I gotta tell you that. So would I. Frankly, I can identify with Nisa. So would I, answered Ergnor. Only it's obvious how they got here. Stories of the Iron Stars and their planet traps have long been circulating around the Great Circle. In the more densely inhabited planets of the galaxy, where ships have been making frequent trips for a long time already, there are planet graveyards of lost spaceships. Many ships, especially the earlier types, got stuck to those planets, and many hair-raising stories are told about them. Stories that are almost legend today, the legends of the arduous conquest of the cosmos. Perhaps there are older spaceships on this planet that belong to more ancient days. Although the meeting of 3 ships in our sparsely populated part of the galaxy is an extraordinary event, so far not a single iron star was known to exist in the vicinity of the sun. We have discovered the first. Do you intend to investigate the disk ship? Asked the biologist. Most certainly. Could a scientist ever forgive himself if he let such an opportunity go? We don't know of any disk spaceships in regions neighboring our solar system. This must be a ship from a great distance that has perhaps been wandering about the galaxy for several thousand years after the death of the crew, or after some irreparable damage. Many transmissions around the Great Circle may become comprehensible to us when we get whatever material there is in the disk ship. It has a very queer form. It's a disc-shaped spiral. The ribs on its exterior are very convex. As soon as we have transferred the cargo from Paris, we're starting on that ship, but at present we cannot take a single person away from work. It took us only a few hours to investigate Paris. I've examined the disk ship through a stereo telescope. It is sealed tight. Not a single opening is to be seen anywhere. It is very difficult to penetrate into any cosmic ship that is reliably protected against forces that are many times stronger than our terrestrial elements. Just try and get into Tantra through her armor of metal with a reorganized internal crystal structure through the Borison plating. It would be a task equal to the siege of a fortress. It's still more difficult to deal with the alien ship, the principles of whose structures are unknown to us, but we'll make an attempt to find out what it is. When we're going to examine what we found in Paris, asked Nisa, there should be some staggeringly interesting observations made in those marvelous worlds mentioned in the message. The telephone transmitted the commander's good-natured laugh. I've been dreaming of Vega since childhood, and am more impatient than any of you, but we have plenty of time for that on the way home. The first thing we have to do is get out of the darkness, out of this inferno, as they used to say in the old days. The Paris explorers did not make any landings, otherwise we should have found the things they brought from those worlds in the collection rooms of the ship. You remember that despite the thorough search we made, we found only films, measurements, lists of surveys, air tests, and containers of explosive dust. Ergnor stopped talking and listened. Even the sensitive microphones did not register the slightest breath of wind. The storm was over. A scraping and rustling sound came through the ground from outside and was echoed by the walls of the turret. The commander raised his hand, and Nisa, who understood him without words, extinguished the light. The darkness seemed as dense inside the turret, warmed up with infrared rays, as if we're standing in black liquid on the bed of an ocean. Flashes of brown light showed through the transparent hood of silica boron. The watchers clearly saw the light spur up, and for a second formed tiny stars with dark red or dark green rays that would go out and then appear again. These little stars stretched out in lines that wavered and bent into circles and figures of 8 and slid soundlessly over the smooth diamond hard surface of the hood. The people in the turret felt a strange acute pain in their eyes and a sharp pain along the bigger nerves of the body, as though the short rays of the brown stars were stabbing the nerve stems like needles. Nisa, whispered Ergnor, turn the regulator on to full and switch on the light suddenly. The turret was lit up with a bright bluish terrestrial light. The people were blinded by it and could see nothing or practically nothing. Ian and Nisa managed to see, or did they imagine it, that the darkness on the right-hand side of the turret did not disappear immediately, but remained for a moment as a flattened condensation of gloom with tentacles attached. The something instantaneously withdrew its tentacles and sprung back into the wall of darkness that the light had pushed farther from the turret. Perhaps those are phantoms, suggested Nisa. Phantom condensations of darkness around a charge of some sort of energy, like our fireballs, and not a form of life at all. If everything here is black, why shouldn't the lightning be black too? That's all very poetical, Nisa objected Ergnor, but hardly likely. In the first place, the something was obviously attacking, was after our living flesh. It or its brethren annihilated the people from Paris. If it's organized and stable, if it can move in a desired direction, if it can accumulate and discharge some sort of energy, then of course there can be no reason of an atmospheric phantom. It's something created from living matter, and it's trying to devour us! Exclamation mark. The biologist supported the commander's conclusion. It seems to me that here, on this planet of darkness, it's dark for us alone because our eyes are not sensitive to the infrared rays of the heat end of the spectrum. But the other end of the spectrum, the yellow and blue rays, should affect these creatures very strongly. Its reaction is so swift that the crew of Paris could not see anything when they illuminated the site of the attack. And if they did see anything, it was already too late. They were unable to tell anybody. Let's repeat the experiment, even if the approach of the thing is unpleasant. Nisa switched off the light, and again the three observers sat in profound darkness, waiting for the approach of the denizens of the world of darkness. What is it armed with? Why is his approach felt through the hood in the spacesuit? Asked the biologist loud. Is this some new form of energy? There are a few forms of energy, and this is most likely electromagnetic. There is no doubt that countless modifications of this form of energy exist. This being has a weapon that affects our nervous system. You can imagine what it would be like if those fillers were to touch the unprotected body. Ergnor flinched, and Nisa Crete shuddered inwardly as they noticed a line of brown lights rapidly approaching from the three sides. There isn't just one thing, exclaimed Eon softly. Perhaps we ought not let them touch the hood. You're right. Let each of us turn his back on the light and look in one direction only. Nisa, switch on. On this occasion, each of the observers noted some details that could be combined to give a general impression of creatures like huge flat jellyfish floating low over the ground with a dense fringe waving in the air below them. Some of the feelers were short when compared with the dimensions of the creature and could not have been more than a yard long. The acute angled corners of the rhomboid body each had two feelers of much greater length. At the base of the feelers, the biologist noticed huge bladders that glowed inside and seemed to be transmitting star-like flashes along them. Hello, observers. Why are you switching the light on and off? Came Ingrid's clear voice in the helmet telephones. Are you in need of help? The storm's over and we're going to begin work. We're coming to you now. Stay where you are, ordered the commander. There is great danger abroad. Call everybody. Ergnor told them about the terrible jellyfish. After consultation, the explorers decided to move part of a planetary motor forward on an automatic car. Exhaust flame 300 meters long swept across the stony place, removing everything visible and invisible from its path. Before half an hour had passed, The crew had repaired the broken cable and protection was restored. They realized that the enemies on fuel must be loaded before the planet's night came again. At the cost of superhuman effort, it was done, and the exhausted travelers retired behind the armor of their tightly sealed spaceship and listened calmly as it trembled in the storm. Microphones brought the roar and rumble of the hurricane to them, but only served to make more cozy the little world of light, impregnable to the powers of darkness. It's kind of like on Spaceship Earth. Megan wrote here, like on Earth. We are on Spaceship Earth, really. Impenetrable darkness, little sphere of light. Yeah. Huh, good analogy. Ingrid and Loma opened the stereo screen. The film had been well chosen. The blue waters of the Indian Ocean splashed at the feet of those sitting in the ship's library. The film showed the Neptune Games, the worldwide competitions in all types of aquatic sports. In the Great Circle era, the entire world's population had grown accustomed to water in a way that had only been possible for the maritime people in earlier days. Swimming, diving, and plunging, surfboard riding, and the sailing of rafts had become universal sports. Thousands of beautiful young bodies, tanned by the sun, ringing songs, laughter, the festive music of the finals. Nisa leaned towards the biologist, who sat beside her deep in thought, carried away his mind to the far distant planet that was his, to that dear planet where nature had been harnessed by man. Did you ever take part in these competitions, Ian? The biologist looked at her somewhat puzzlingly. What? Oh, these? No, never. I was thinking and didn't understand you at first. Weren't you thinking about that? Asked the girl, pointing to the screen. Don't you find your appreciation of beauty of our world come so much fresher to you after all this darkness, after the storms and the jellyfish? Of course I do, but that only makes me all the more anxious to get hold of one of those jellyfish. I was racking my brains over that, trying to think of a way to capture one. Nisa Crete turned away from the smiling biologist and met Ergnor's smile. Have you too been thinking about how to catch that black horror? She asked mockingly. No, but I was thinking of how to explore the disc-shaped spaceship, he said, and the sly glint in the commander's eyes almost annoyed Nisa. Now I understand why it is that men engaged in wars in the old days. I used to think it was only the boastfulness of your sex, the so-called strong sex of that unorganized society. Absolutely right, because it's not a strong sex. Males are not the strong sex. It's just in our current society, we still believe that, right? A lot of people do. Patriarchy. I like that quote. I'm glad that this was underlined. So-called strong sex of that unorganized society. Remind me to make a blog post or another vlog in the future about my view on what is considered the strong sex. Okay, anyways, continuing on. You're not quite right, although you're pretty near to understanding our old-time psychology. My ideas are simple. The more beautiful I find my planet, the more I get to love it. The more I want to serve it, to plant gardens, extract metals, produce power and food, create music, so that when I passed on my way, I shall leave behind me a little piece of something real made by my hands and my head. The only thing I know is the cosmos, astronautics, and that is the only way I can serve mankind. The goal is not the flight itself, but the acquisition of fresh knowledge, the discovery of new worlds which we shall, in time, turn into planets as beautiful as our Earth. And what aim have you in view, Nisa? Why are you so interested in the disk spaceship? Is it mere curiosity? Wow, that's actually really beautiful. I like that. Sorry for this. Another comment here. I shouldn't say sorry. It's my vlog. I wrote actually a very spiritual poem a while ago about how beautiful our planet is and how when we go into other worlds, we can turn them into beautiful planets as well. And, you know, reading this little passage here, his little dialogue, I suppose, his part of the dialogue. I just suddenly thought of that poem I wrote. Yeah, interesting. I suppose that is partly how I think as well, like purpose in life. If I was living in this era, sometimes I wish I was like, you know, in the future and we're already exploring new worlds. Maybe one day. All right. Anyway, continue on. With a great effort, the girl overcame the weight of her tired arms and stretched them out to the commander. He took her little hands in his and stroked them gently. Nisa's cheeks flushed until they matched the tight auburn curls on her head. That's cute. New strength flowed through her tired body. She pressed her cheek to Ergnor's hand as she had done in the moment of the dangerous landing, and she forgave the biologist his seeming treachery to Earth. To show that she was in agreement with both of them, she told him of an idea that had just entered her head. They could furnish one of the water tanks with a self-closing lid, place a piece of fresh preserved meat, a rare luxury they sometimes enjoyed in addition to their canned food, as bait, and should the black something crawl inside and the lid close, they could fill the tank with inert terrestrial gas through a previously arranged tap and seal the edges of the lid. Ian was very enthusiastic of the resourcefulness of the auburn-headed girl. He was almost the same age as Nisa and permitted himself the gentle familiarity that is born of school years spent together. By the end of the 9 years of the planetary, 9 days. By the end of the 9 days of the planetary night, the trap perfected by the engineers was ready. Ergnor was busy with the adjustment of a man-like robot, and he also got ready a powerful hydraulic cutting tool with which he hoped to make his way into the spiral disk from some distant star. The storm died down in the now familiar darkness. The frost gave way to warmth, and the day that was 9 terrestrial days long began. They had worked for four terrestrial days to load the ion charges, some other supplies, and valuable instruments. In addition to these things, Ergnor considered it necessary to take some of the personal belongings of the lost crew, so that after a thorough disinfection, they could be taken to Earth for the relatives of the dead people to keep in their memory. In the Great Circle area, people did not burden themselves with many possessions, so their transfer to Tantra offered no difficulties. On the 5th day, they switched off the current, and the biologists and 2 volunteers, Kay Baer and Ingrid Dietra, shut themselves up in the observation turret at Paris. The black creatures appeared almost immediately. The biologists had adapted an infrared screen and could follow the movement of the jellyfish. One of them soon approached the tank trap, folded up its tentacles, rolled itself up into a ball, and started creeping inside. Suddenly, another black rhombus appeared at the open lid of the tank. The one that first arrived unfolded its tentacles, and star-like flashes came with such rapidity that they turned into a strip of vibrant dark red light, which the screen reproduced as flashes of green lightning. The first jellyfish moved back, and the second immediately rolled up into a ball and fell onto the bottom of the tank. The biologist held his hand out toward the switch, but K-Bear held it back. The first monster had also rolled up and followed the second, so that there were 2 of the terrible brutes in the tank. It was amazing that they could reduce their apparent proportions to such extent. The biologist pressed the switch, the lid closed, and immediately 5 or 6 of the black monsters fastened onto the zirconium-covered tank. The biologist turned on the light and asked Tantra to switch on to the protection of the road. The black phantoms, as usual, dissolved immediately, except for the 2 that remained imprisoned in the hermetically sealed tank. The biologist went out to the tank, touched the lid, and got such a severe shock that he could not restrain himself and shouted out loud. His left arm hung limp, paralyzed. Mechanic Terran put on a high-temperature protective spacesuit and was then able to fill the tank with pure terrestrial nitrogen and weld the lid down. The taps were also welded, and then the tank was wrapped in a spare piece of ship's insulation and placed in the collection room. Success had been achieved at a high price, for the biologist's arm remained paralyzed despite the efforts of the physician. Eon Thaw was in great pain, but he did not dream of refusing to take part in the expedition to the disk ship. Ergnor, compelled to submit to his insatiable thirst for exploration, could not leave him on Tantra. The spiral disk, a visitor from distant worlds, turned out to be farther from Paris than they had expected. In the diffused light of the projectors, they had not judged the size of the spaceship correctly. It was a truly gigantic structure, nearly 350 meters in diameter. They had to take the cables from Paris in order to stretch their protective systems as far as the disk. The mysterious spaceship hung over the travelers like a vertical wall, stretching high over their heads and disappearing in the speckled sky. Jet black clouds massed around the upper edges of the giant disk. The hull of the vessel was covered in some green substance the color of malachite. It was badly cracked in places and proved to be about a meter thick. Through the cracks gleamed some bright light blue metal that had turned to a dark blue in places where the malachite covering had been rubbed off. The side of the disk facing Paris was furnished with a protuberance that curved in a spiral 15 meters in diameter and some 10 meters thick. The other side of the disk, the side that was lost in the pitch darkness, was more convex, like a section of a sphere attached to the disk 20 meters thick. On that side also, there was a spiral protuberance that looked like the end of the spiral pipe emerging from the ship. The edge of the gigantic disk was sunk deep into the ground. At the foot of this metal wall, the explorers saw that stones had melted and flowed away in all directions like thick pitch. They spent many hours looking for some sort of entrance or hatch. Either it was hidden under the malachite paint, or drafts where the ship's hatches closed so neatly that no trace of them was left outside. They could not find any orifices for optical instruments or stopcocks for any sort of blast. The metal disc seemed to be solid. Ergnord had foreseen such a possibility and had decided to open up the ship with an electro-hydraulic tool capable of cutting through the hardest and most viscous covering of the terrestrial spaceships. After a short discussion, they all agreed that the robot should open the tip of the spiral. There should be a hollow space there, a pipe or circular gangway leading around the ship, through which they hoped to get in the ship without the risk of running into a number of bulkheads that would bar their way. The study of the spiral disk would be of great interest. Inside this visitor from distant worlds, there might be instruments and records, all the furniture and utensils of those who had brought the ship through such expanses that in comparison, the journeys made by terrestrial astronauts were nothing but timid sallies into outer space. On the far side of the disk, the spiral came right down to the ground. A floodlight and high voltage cable were taken there, and the bluish light that was reflected from the disk was dispersing in dull haze spreading across the plateau as far as some high objects of indefinite shape, probably cliffs in which there was a gap of impenetrable darkness. Neither the pale reflected light of the hazy stars nor the floodlights gave any feeling of ground in that black gap. It was probably a steep slope leading down to the lowland plain that I had been seeing when Tantra was landing. With a low, dull growl, the automatic car, loaded with the only universal robot on the ship, crawled towards the disk. The unusual weight did not make any difference to the robot, and it moved quickly to its place beside the metal wall. It resembled a fat man on short legs with a long body and a huge head that leaned forward menacingly. The robot was controlled by Ignore. In its four front limbs, it raised its heavy cutter and stood with its legs placed firmly apart, ready to begin its dangerous undertaking. Only K-Bear and I will direct the robot, since we are wearing high protection suits, said the commander in the intercommunication phone. All those in light biological spacesuits will go farther away. The commander hesitated. Something penetrated in his mind, causing inexplicable anguish. It made his knees weaken under him. The proud will of man had wilted away and given place to the dumb obedience of an animal. Sticky with perspiration from head to foot, Ergnor, with no will of his own, strode towards the black gap in the darkness. A cry from Nisa that he heard in the telephone brought him back to his senses. He stood still, but the power of darkness that had taken control of his psyche again drove him forward. Following the commander, halting and obviously struggling with themselves, when K-Bear and Eon Thaw, who had been standing on the fringe of the circle of light, away out there in the gates of darkness and the clouds of mist, there was a movement of weird forms beyond the comprehension of man, and therefore the more awe-inspiring. This was not the now familiar jellyfish-like creature. In the gray half-light, there moved a black cross with widely outstretched arms and a convex ellipse in the middle. 3 points of the cross had lenses on them, reflecting the light of the flood lamp that scarcely penetrated the misty, humid atmosphere. The base of the cross was invisible in the darkness of an unilluminated depression on the ground. Ergnor, who was walking faster than the others, drew near the unknown object and fell to the ground about 100 paces away from it. Before the stupefied onlookers could realize that it was a life and death matter for their commander, the black cross had risen above the ring of cables. It bent forward like the stem of a plant and clearly intended leaning over the protective field to get Ergnor. Nisa, in frenzy that lent her the strength of an athlete, ran to the robot and started turning the control levers at the back of its head. Slowly and somewhat uncertainly, the robot lifted the cutter. Then the girl, afraid that she would be unable to work the intricate machine, jumped forward and with her body covered the commander. Serpentine streams of light or lightning came from the 3 points of the cross. Oh, wow. So the girl, is in the way. Dang. The girl fell on Ergnor with her arms spread out on either side. Fortunately, the robot had by this time turned the funnel of the cutter with its sharp instrument inside towards the center of the black cross. The thing bent convulsively backwards, seemed to fall flat on the ground, and then disappeared in impenetrable darkness into the cliffs. Ergnor and his two companions immediately recovered, lifted up the girl, and retired back behind the disc. The others had by this time recovered from the shock and were wheeling out the cannon improvised from a planetary motor. With a savage ferocity such as had never before experienced, Ergnor directed the destructive radiation beam to the cliffs with their gate-like gap, taking special care to sweep the plane without missing a single inch. Eonthal knelt on the ground in front of the motionless Nisa, calling her softly on the telephone and trying to get a glimpse of her face through the silicoid helmet. The girl lay dead still with her eyes closed. With no sound of breathing could be heard in the telephone, nor could the biologist detect it through the spacesuit. Oh, man. The monster had killed Nisa, cried Eonthal bitterly as soon as Ergnor approached them. It was impossible to see the commander's eyes through the narrow slit in the high protection helmet. Take her to Loma on Tantra immediately. The metallic note resounded more strongly than ever in Ergnor's voice. You two, help her find out the nature of the injury. The 6 of us will remain here and continue the investigation. The geologists can go back with you and collect specimens of all the rocks between here and Tantra. We cannot remain on this planet any longer. The exploration here must be carried out in high protection tanks. But if we go on like this, we'll only ruin the whole expectation. Take the third car and hurry. Ergnor turned around and, without looking back, made his way to the disc spaceship. The cannon was pushed forward. The engineer mechanic who stood behind it swept the plane with it every 10 minutes, covering a semicircle with a disc at its center. The robot raised his cutter to the second outer loop of the spiral, which on the side where the edge of the disc was deeply sunk in the ground was level with the robot's breast. The loud roar that followed could be heard even through the high protection space helmets. Thin cracks appeared on the section of the malachite coating that had been chosen. Pieces of that hard material flew off and struck resoundingly against the metal body of the robot. Lateral motions of the cutter removed a big slab of the outer layer, revealing a bright, light blue granular surface that was pleasant to the eyes even in the glare of the flood lamp. K-Bear marked out a square big enough to allow a man in a spacesuit to pass and set the robot to making a deep channel in the blue metal without cutting right through it. The robot cut a second line at an angle to the first and then began moving the sharp end of the cutter back and forth, increasing the pressure as it did so. When the mechanical servant cut the third side of the square, the lines he had made began to move outwards. Look out, get back, everybody, lie down, howled Argnor in the microphone as he switched off the robot and staggered back. The thick slab of metal suddenly bent outwards like the lid of a tin can. A stream of extraordinarily bright, rainbow-colored fire burst out of the hole and flew off at a tangent from the spiral protuberance. This and the fact that the blue metal melted and immediately closed the hole that had been cut saved the unfortunate explorers. Nothing remained of the mighty robot but a mass of molten metal with 2 short metal legs sticking pitifully out of it. Wow. Ergnor and K-Bear escaped because of the special protection suits they were wearing. The explosion threw them far back from this particular spaceship. It hurled the others back, too, overturned the cannon, and broke the high-voltage cables. When the people recovered from the shock, they realized they were defenseless. Fortunately for them, they were lying in the rays of the undamaged floodlights. Although nobody had been hurt, Ergnor decided that they have had enough. They had enough. They abandoned unnecessary tools, cables, and the flood lamp, piled onto the undamaged car, and beat a hurried retreat to their spaceship. This unfortunate outcome of an incautious attempt to open an alien spaceship was by no means due to the foresight of the commander. A second attempt would have ended with some serious accident. Anissa, the pretty astronavigator. What of her? Ergnor hoped that the spacesuit would have weakened the lethal power of the Black Cross. After all, the biologists had not been killed by contact with a Black Medusa, but out in the cosmos, so far from the mighty terrestrial medical institutions, would they be able to counteract the effects of an unknown weapon? In the airlock, K-Bear drew near to the commander and pointed to the rear side of his left shoulder armor. Ergnor turned towards the mirrors that were always provided in the locks for those who returned from an alien planet to examine themselves. The thin sheet of zircono titanium of which the shoulder armor was made had been torn. A piece of sky blue metal struck out of the furrow it had cut in the insulation lining, although it had not reached the inner layer of the suit. That difficulty in removing the metal splintered. At the cost of great risk and in final analysis, by sheer chance, they had obtained a specimen of the mysterious metal of which the spiral disc spaceship was made and which would now be taken back to Earth. Alas, Ergnor, divested of his heavy spacesuit, was able to enter his ship, or rather to crawl in under the influence of the gravity of the fearful planet. The entire expedition was relieved when he arrived. They had watched a catastrophe at the disc through their stereo visiophones and had no need to ask what the result had been. Thus ends chapter 3. Okay, chapter 4 I am not going to read right here, but just for those who care to know, it's called The River of Time. Might read it tomorrow morning. I'm feeling pretty tired right now. I guess reading this does take a while. It's been like 2 hours of reading. I read chapter 2 and chapter 3. I do have to return this book. I'm probably going to buy a copy so I can keep reading it. This is a really good book. I really like it a lot. So anyways, I just threw in some side commentaries because, well, when I'm reading out loud, I like to just, I don't know, randomly say things. It keeps it interesting, at least for my own head. Yeah, and it spawns little conversations. Like, I'll read that poem about finding new Earth. That was interesting. The conversation between the commander and Nisa about the purpose in life, cosmic purpose, um, and also about Nisa saying the strong sex of that unorganized society. Yeah, I'm definitely going to do a future little talk about, um, you know, the nature of, if we're just going to say biologically male or female, like who is actually the stronger sex, Um, anyway, with all that said, it's like 3:11 in the morning right now, uh, on December 22nd, 2024. So I will call it quits for now. I'm probably going to get dressed in something a little more comfortable before I go to bed, and brush my teeth. So yeah, got it, Keith. And yeah, I like this. So it's really interesting how this is like a scientific utopia versus more like a, rather than a religious one. But there's definitely a lot of spiritual undertones. I like this a lot. So anyway, with all that said, I called it good night.